Hey everyone, and welcome back to ByHollyG. Welcome to today's video. So I am going to be sharing with you all 10 facts about protein, and yeah, we're going to dive straight into this video because I have a lot to share with you all. So definitely like it if you enjoy it, comment down below if you have any questions or video ideas, and if you want to stick around you can hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know when I upload. In molecular biology terms, protein is a type of macromolecule, so it's this big molecule and it's what we specifically refer to as a polymer. Now, a polymer is this general term for a macromolecule that is composed of repeating units, and those repeating units are what we call monomers. So a protein is a polymer and its repeating units or its monomers are amino acids, and lots of people have heard of amino acids. We are going to talk more about them later, but lots of amino acids join together through peptide bonds to form what we call a polypeptide chain, and then that gets folded and modified to make a protein. Secondly then, in terms of nutrition and from a nutritional perspective, protein is one of our 3 macronutrients, so alongside carbohydrates and fats. And I grew up learning about the Eat Well plate, and I thought and I was taught that protein comes from like meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, animal foods essentially, but we shouldn't forget that plants do also contain protein. Plants are our producers of the food chains, and plant sources that are rich in protein include like nuts, seeds, lentils, beans, legumes, tofu, tempeh. There are so many plant sources out there that provide protein, and most people will be familiar with the fact that proteins are needed for growth and repair, which is true, but we can argue that proteins are the most important molecules in cells. They build cells and they allow cells to do stuff. So they are the most important functional molecules, we can say, in the body. We essentially have 20 genetically encoded amino acids, which means that they are encoded by our DNA, which we will address in question 3. Now, just a small side note, we do have 22 amino acids that exist throughout the whole of life, but I'm not going to talk about the 2 kind of anomalies. And all amino acids basically have a similar structure, which we're just going to outline now. So every amino acid has this central carbon atom, and it's what we call the alpha carbon bonded to a single hydrogen atom, a carboxy group, or also known as a carboxyl group, an amino group, and also an R group. Now that R group is the variable group. Every amino acid will have a different R group, and that basically defines the amino acid. Lastly then, from a nutritional perspective, we have 20 amino acids, as I said. 9 out of the 20 are essential, and that means that they have to be derived from our diet. We cannot synthesize those in our bodies. And then the 11 other amino acids, they are non-essential. They can be made by our bodies, so they don't necessarily need to be consumed through what you eat as your diet. So as I said before, amino acids are encoded by our DNA, and basically our DNA is a sequence of bases. We have 4 bases in our DNA. We have A, T, C, and G, and that DNA sequence provides the information for our cells to make amino acids and then protein. And then the genetic code specifically refers to the fact that every 3 bases in our DNA codes for a single amino acid, and this is what we call a triplet code, and it's read in a non-overlapping manner. So your DNA sequence might go AAT, GGC, and the AAT will be read and that will code for an amino acid, and then the GGC will be read next because it's non-overlapping, and that will encode the next amino acid along. In this table, I should point out that you can't see a T as a base, you can only see a U, and if you haven't done biology before, then I just want you to remember that U is the equivalent of T, and if you have done biology, then you'll know that's because of transcription and translation that happens to make a protein. So we're going to do a bit of maths, and if you don't get this, then feel free to replay this. But as I said, we have this genetic code, and it's a triplet code because every 3 bases of DNA codes for a single amino acid. And if we calculate the number of ways in which we can combine 3 bases, and we have 4 bases to pick from, then the calculation you need to do is 4 to the power of 3, because you have 4 bases and you need to put 3 of them in a particular order. So it's 4 to the power of 3, and that gives you 64 different possible combinations. So that technically means that we could encode for 64 different amino acids. However, as I said, we only have 20. So why do we have this excess basically, and that is what we basically refer to as degeneracy. The genetic code is degenerate. What degeneracy means is that a single amino acid can be coded for by more than one particular triplet of bases, which we can refer to as a codon. So if you just think of a codon as a triplet of bases, a single amino acid can be coded for by more than one codon. That is degeneracy, and this is really advantageous evolutionarily because it means that if we have a mutation, and a mutation is just a spontaneous change to your DNA sequence, if we have multiple codons that can code for a single amino acid, then it means that a mutation may not change the amino acid it codes for, and we won't therefore change the protein and then the overall function. And the final thing I just want to say about the genetic code is that every protein in eukaryotes, so animals you can think of, every protein will start with the particular amino acid that we call methionine, and that's encoded by the triplet of bases that we call AUG. Remember that U, if you haven't done biology, is just equivalent of T. And then we also have stop codons. Stop codons, they don't code for an amino acid. They basically act as a signal to stop protein synthesis. And that nicely leads me on to question 4. So how are proteins made in the body? And this is going to be an oversimplification, but it takes place in 2 main stages. As I said, proteins, the information for making a protein is coded for in our DNA. So we have to start at DNA. And the 2 main stages are transcription and translation. Transcription then starts in the nucleus because the nucleus is where the DNA is found. And transcription basically takes DNA, that DNA sequence, and it turns it into a molecule that we call mRNA, or messenger RNA. And that acts as like an intermediate. And as I said before, T and U are kind of equivalents. When the DNA is transcribed into mRNA, every T in the DNA sequence will be replaced with U because U is the base found in RNA, whereas T is the equivalent in DNA. I wouldn't worry too much about it, as I said though, if you haven't done biology. Just remember that transcription is where DNA turns into messenger RNA, and that acts as like our little messenger. It gets transported out of the nucleus and into the cytoplasm of a cell, and then it goes to a structure that we call the ribosome, because a ribosome is an organelle where translation takes place, which is the second step in protein synthesis. And translation is where we basically take that mRNA, that messenger molecule, and we turn it into a polypeptide chain. Because what happens is every codon, or every 3 bases, is read as a triplet, and then that codes for a single amino acid. So translation translates that mRNA into an amino acid sequence, or in other words, a polypeptide chain. And remember at the start I said that a polypeptide chain is just a linear sequence of amino acids joined by peptide bonds. And then in order to make that into a mature protein, we can say, it has to be like folded and modified. And then after that, that mature protein needs to be transported to where it needs to go in the cell, or maybe outside the cell. But that in essence is what happens when we make proteins. If we just go back further and we think about diet and us eating food, obviously we will eat foods that are rich in protein or that contain protein, and those proteins are broken down into small peptide units or even single amino acids, which then get absorbed across the small intestinal wall into the blood. And then those amino acids, they provide the building blocks for the synthesis of new proteins in the process that I just described. In biology, and especially in molecular biology, we describe proteins as having 4 levels of structure. They have primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary levels of structure. That primary structure of a protein basically defines its particular amino acid sequence, and that amino acid sequence, as I said before, is ultimately determined by the sequence of bases in your DNA. As a result of transcription and translation, as I said, we end up with this linear polypeptide chain, and then it starts to be folded. So the secondary structure of a protein describes that first level of folding. That polypeptide chain gets folded into 2 particular structures. We have alpha helices and beta pleated sheets, and those structures are formed by hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bonds allow those amino acids to associate with each other and form the alpha helix, which is kind of like a coil, and beta pleated sheets. And even though hydrogen bonds are individually quite weak, when we have a lot of hydrogen bonds overall, that can create quite a strong and sturdy structure. We then have the tertiary structure of a protein. So that's where the polypeptide chain is further folded, we can say, and that requires more hydrogen bonding, but it also uses other types of bonding as well. So for example, disulfide bridges and ionic bonds. And this is further folding that polypeptide chain into a specific conformation, which in biology we just say a conformation describes a particular 3D shape. And what's really important about proteins is that their structure ultimately determines their function. So the folding of this polypeptide chain into a particular conformation is really, really important. The fourth level of structure then is the quaternary structure, as I said. However, the thing to remember with quaternary structure is that not every protein has a quaternary structure. Quaternary structure is defined as more than one polypeptide chain joined together to form a mature protein. So some proteins in our bodies are just formed by one polypeptide chain that is folded in upon itself, and that's the mature protein. And in that case, the protein wouldn't have quaternary structure, because for a protein to have quaternary structure, it needs to be composed of more than one polypeptide chain. And so yeah, we have some proteins then that are formed by joining together more than one polypeptide chain, and in that case it would have quaternary structure. A protein can also have a quaternary structure if that polypeptide chain or those polypeptide chains come together with an inorganic molecule as part of the whole structure. Question number 6 is then quite a quick one. So it's how much protein should I be getting in my diet every single day? And the RDA, so the recommended daily allowance, is a minimum of 0.8 grams of protein for every kilogram of body weight. And so that is around 56 grams for males on average, and then 46 for females. But as I said, that's the minimum amount, and your protein intake will very much depend on like you as an individual and lots of lifestyle factors, so like how active you are, how old you are, whether you're male or female and stuff like this. So yeah, I would just use that as a benchmark. But if you are looking for like proper nutritional advice, then you should go and speak to a nutritionist, and I'm not one of those. Carbohydrates, say like glucose and fats, they can be stored in our bodies when there is excess, but with protein that's not the case. Like we can't store protein as protein itself in our bodies, so we have to do something with it. The key organ involved in this and where this whole process starts is the liver, because excess amino acids in the liver, they undergo a process called deamination. And if we remember the structure of an amino acid, we have that central carbon atom, and one of the 4 groups bonded to that carbon atom was the amino group. And deamination refers to the removal of that amino group. That amino group, it could be used to build other amino acids in a process called transamination, where we basically transfer that amino group onto a different amino acid backbone, and it can be used to form those non-essential amino acids, so the ones that we build inside our bodies. But the alternative fate is that that amino group can be removed in deamination and it can form ammonia in the liver. And because ammonia is toxic, it has to be turned into something that's not toxic, so we have to get it out of our bodies. So also in the liver, that ammonia can go through a cycle that we call the urea cycle, and we produce urea, which is one of the components of urine, and then that urea travels to the kidneys, where it's filtered out of the bloodstream into our urine and it's excreted from our body. Before I move on to the next question, I also want to address what happens to the rest of that amino acid, because deamination just removes the amino group. What happens to the rest of it? And the rest of it is basically what we refer to as the organic acid, or more specifically the alpha keto acid, and it has different fates in the body. So it could be turned into compounds so that it could get funneled through respiratory pathways and used to release energy or make ATP in our bodies, or it can be converted to like carbohydrates or fats to then be stored in the body. Question number 8 is it bad for your health to basically eat too much protein? And the short answer is yes, you can get too much protein. This is normally an excess of 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, and it's mostly associated with too much animal protein, which can basically impose metabolic burdens on your body. So for example, you could be at increased risk of bone loss and an increased risk of fractures, which sounds kind of counterintuitive when protein is needed for growth and repair. So as I said, it can affect your bones, your kidneys, so you could have like kidney stones, for example, and you can also like harm your liver. And all of this is then made worse if you have like an underlying condition like chronic kidney disease, which compromises your kidney function. And as I said before, this is associated with too much protein coming from like meat and animal products, and that can also increase your risk of like coronary heart disease because of excess saturated fat and cholesterol in your diet, and it can also increase your risk of cancer like colon cancer, for example. Processed meat is classified as a carcinogen, so something that causes cancer, and the mechanistic basis of this is because of the heme iron and the nitrates in the processed meat. But the bottom line is that they can cause cancer, they can contribute to the development of tumours. Compared to animal proteins, plant proteins are harder to digest. And there are quite a few reasons as to why this is the case, but this is generally because they have like different structures to animal proteins. They have a higher fibre content, which kind of like prevents and impedes their breakdown by enzymes in digestion. And plant proteins also contain compounds that will prevent and inhibit their digestion. So that's the first thing, they aren't digested as easily. And secondly, plant proteins may not contain all of your 9 essential amino acids, and in this respect they are said to be lower quality protein sources compared to their animal counterparts. However, the thing to remember with plant proteins is that if you are consuming a balanced diet, then you will end up getting all of your 9 essential amino acids if you eat a variety of food. If we look at like populations of vegans and like even vegetarians, in developed nations where you have access to enough food, then protein deficiency is like not a thing. It's only those who are not consuming enough overall, or are just avoiding certain proteins or certain foods with protein in, they might be at risk of not getting enough of certain amino acids. Children who are vegan and follow like a plant-based diet can also get enough protein. Whilst there is some evidence that kind of suggests that elderly individuals might be lacking certain amino acids, there isn't evidence for like any functional deficiency as a result of that. So the overall conclusion is that if you eat a balanced plant-based diet, then you can still get enough protein. And going back to what I was saying before, plant proteins as like a whole package, they contain lower levels of saturated fat and cholesterol, they contain a higher fiber content, more vitamins and more minerals, so they are generally and overall healthier than your animal proteins. Something else that I find so interesting is that blue zones around the world are the places with some of the longest living people, and they more often than not follow a plant-based diet, and they don't show protein deficiencies. They are very active and they are very healthy, but they can get enough protein, and as I said, they're like blue zones, so they contain people with like the longest life expectancies. The final thing I just wanted to talk about was like protein intake and like muscle building. So a lot of people worry that if they follow a vegan or a plant-based diet, then they won't be able to build muscle as effectively. There are studies and there is evidence to show that plant proteins in comparison to animal proteins are not as effective in supporting protein anabolism. So anabolism describes the building up of stuff, so like building muscle. Plant proteins don't support that as well. However, those studies are conducted over an acute or a short time period. One very recent study that compared the consumption of animal proteins to plant proteins in a population, it was a very small sample, and this is just one paper, and more research will obviously need to be done, but studies are now starting to show that a plant-based diet and plant proteins can support muscle growth just as effectively as animal protein, and that is when people are followed over a longer time period. And that is arguably a lot more realistic, because muscle growth and building muscle, like through going to the gym and working out, doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And so plant proteins and animal proteins are looking to be equally effective in supporting muscle growth and building muscle. So like, if you want to build muscle and, you know, stuff like that in the gym, then I would not worry at all. Question number 10 is then, what are some common proteins to know about? And I just wanted to give you guys some examples, because I realized I've talked a lot about protein, but I haven't given you any specific examples, and you might want to go away and research a particular protein to find out more about it. Hemoglobin is the first one on my list. Hemoglobin is a protein with a quaternary structure. It actually has 4 different polypeptide chains, and it's the protein found in red blood cells that is responsible for transporting oxygen all around our bodies. And myoglobin is a similar molecule. It doesn't actually have a quaternary structure, but it's kind of like the equivalent of hemoglobin, but only for muscle cells. Enzymes in the body are proteins, and enzymes are biological catalysts that basically drive chemical reactions, and most enzymes in biology end in A's. So if you see something ending in A, so for example like DNA polymerase or ATP synthase, those are enzymes. Not every enzyme ends in A's, but most of them do in biology. We have transport proteins, which basically allow substances across membranes, and examples of those are like the aquaporins. Aquaporins allow the transport of water. And then we have glutes, not like your muscles in like your bum, but like glucose transporters. They are proteins and they allow glucose in and out of cells. Transcription factors are proteins and they are really important in the process of transcription, which is what I talked about before, so in turning DNA into messenger RNA. The last two then are collagen and keratin. Collagen is found in like the extracellular matrix, so that is kind of like the glue that holds cells together, and it's mostly made by a cell type called a fibroblast. And then keratin, it's found in like epithelial tissue, so like our skin, and it's also used to make like hair and nails as structures. So yeah, collagen and keratin are both really important as well, but just remember there are so many proteins in our bodies. So those are my 10 facts all about protein. I hope this video was enjoyable and useful. I hope you learned something at the very least. And yeah, as I said at the start, definitely give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Comment down below with any questions, video ideas, and subscribe for loads more content. And as always, I will speak to you very soon in another video. Bye!